The letter arrived on a quiet morning, the kind of morning that felt too still. Nora stood by the window of her small apartment, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Outside, the street moved like any other day, people walking, cars passing, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But for Nora, everything had already changed. Her grandmother was gone. The house felt empty without her voice in the background, without her gentle questions, without the soft humming she always did while cooking. Nora had grown up with her grandmother for most of her childhood. When her parents moved away for work, it was her grandmother who stayed, who listened, who remembered. And now, the only thing left was a letter. The lawyer's words were clear and simple. After her grandmother's passing, Nora had inherited the remote house where her grandmother had lived alone for years. A house far from the city. A house surrounded by hills and silence. A house most people had forgotten even existed. Nora had not been there in more than 10 years. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Her hands felt heavy. Part of her wanted to refuse the inheritance, to leave the past where it was. But another part of her felt pulled, like a quiet voice calling her back. 2 days later, she packed a small bag and drove toward the countryside. The road grew narrower the farther she went. Tall trees leaned close, their branches forming a tunnel of shadows. The signal on her phone faded, then disappeared completely. Nora did not turn back. She kept driving, guided by memory more than directions. She remembered this road. She remembered holding her grandmother's hand, counting trees, asking endless questions. She remembered laughter. When the house finally appeared, Nora slowed the car. It stood alone at the edge of a wide clearing. Old stone walls. A sloped roof darkened by time. The windows looked tired, like eyes that had watched too much and said nothing. The house had not changed much. But it felt smaller. Quieter. Nora stepped out of the car and closed the door gently. The air smelled of earth and old leaves. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying a sound that felt like a sigh. She stood there for a long moment before walking toward the front door. The key felt cold in her hand. Her grandmother had mailed it months ago, with a short note. "You may need this someday, keep it safe." Nora slid the key into the lock. It turned slowly, resisting at first, then giving in. The door opened with a low creak. Inside, the house smelled like wood, dust, and something familiar that made Nora's chest tighten. Everything was still in its place. The small table near the window. The old chair with the faded cushion. The clock on the wall that no longer ticked. Nora stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The silence was heavy, not empty. It felt full, like the house was holding its breath. She walked slowly from room to room. The kitchen looked untouched. A cup still sat near the sink. A towel hung where it always had. Nora brushed her fingers across the counter, memories rising with every step. In the living room, she stopped. On the shelf stood a framed photo of her as a child, smiling wide, her grandmother beside her with an arm around her shoulders. Nora picked it up and felt her throat tighten. She pressed the frame lightly against her chest. "I should have visited more," she whispered. The words stayed in the air, unanswered. Nora climbed the narrow stairs to the upper floor. Each step creaked under her weight, as if the house recognized her. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small window at the end. 2 doors stood closed. One was her grandmother's bedroom. The other was a door Nora had never opened. She stood in front of it now, heart beating faster. The door was plain, almost hidden. As a child, she had been told not to go inside. Her grandmother had never raised her voice, but that door had been one rule she never explained. Nora reached out and touched the handle. It was unlocked. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. The room inside was small and neat. A desk stood against the wall. Shelves lined with boxes and folders filled the space. Everything was organized carefully, as if waiting. Nora stepped inside slowly. On the desk lay a single envelope. Her name was written on it. Nora's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable, gentle, familiar. She opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a thin notebook. The letter came first. My dear Nora, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to explain things in person. Please forgive me for what I did not say while I could. Nora felt her eyes burn. She sat down slowly, holding the paper like it might fall apart. I loved you more than words. I kept things from you not to protect myself, but to protect you. This house holds memories I could not carry alone. Nora wiped her eyes and kept reading. There are things about your family that were never spoken, stories that were buried with good intentions, but silence can hurt as much as truth. Her hands shook. The weight of the words pressed against her chest. She opened the notebook next. Inside were pages filled with writing, dates, small notes, pressed flowers, drawings Nora remembered making as a child. Between the pages were letters never sent, photos never shown, and stories never told. One photo slipped out and fell onto the floor. Nora picked it up. It showed her mother as a young woman, standing beside the same house. Her face looked sad. Beside her stood Nora's grandmother, holding her hand tightly. On the back of the photo were words written softly. This is where everything changed. Nora felt tears spill down her face. Her grandmother had kept every piece of her life, every pain, every love, every regret, not hidden away in darkness, but saved carefully, waiting for the right time. And now, that time had come. Nora covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she cried quietly in the small room. The house was not lonely. It had been waiting for her to come back and finally understand why her grandmother never let go. Nora stayed seated on the small chair for a long time, the letter resting in her lap, the notebook open beside her. Her tears slowed, but the ache in her chest remained. It was the kind of ache that did not fade quickly. It stayed, asking to be understood. She wiped her face and took a deep breath. The room felt closer now, like it had leaned in while she cried. Nora looked around again, noticing details she had missed before. The boxes on the shelves were labeled by year. Some were neat and clear. Others had labels written again and again, as if her grandmother had changed her mind about what to call them. Nora stood and opened the nearest box. Inside were folded letters tied with a thin ribbon. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but careful. She untied the ribbon and picked one at random. It was addressed to her mother. My child, I see the way you look at this house. I know you want to leave, but please understand why I stay. Nora's breath caught. She sat back down and read slowly. The letter spoke of choices. Of a young woman who felt trapped between the life she wanted and the past she could not escape. It spoke of fear passed down quietly, like a habit no one remembered starting. Nora opened another letter. Then another. Each one added another piece to the story. Her grandmother had not lived alone by accident. She had stayed in this remote place to hold something together when everything else had begun to fall apart. Nora closed her eyes and leaned back. As a child, she remembered her mother leaving the house angry, crying, promising never to return. Nora had been too young to understand. Her grandmother had never spoken badly about her mother. She had simply said some hearts needed distance to heal. Nora stood again and moved to the shelves on the far wall. One box stood apart from the others. No label. Just a small carved mark on the lid, a flower Nora used to draw again and again when she was little. She opened it carefully. Inside were objects instead of papers. A small bracelet. A worn scarf. A broken watch. Each item stirred a memory so strong it felt like a wave. Nora picked up the bracelet. It had been hers. She remembered losing it during one summer visit and crying for hours. Her grandmother had told her not to worry, that nothing truly lost ever disappears. Nora pressed the bracelet to her palm. You kept everything, she whispered. She carried the box downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. The afternoon light had shifted, stretching long shadows across the floor. The house no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with voices that had never been allowed to speak. Nora poured herself a glass of water, her hands still unsteady. She sat at the table and opened the notebook again, this time starting from the first page. The early pages were filled with simple notes. Weather, repairs, garden plans. Then the writing changed. It became more personal. Today she asked again why her mother never comes. I told her the truth would come when she was ready. I pray I am right. Nora swallowed hard. Several pages later, she found a section folded inward, as if her grandmother had hesitated before writing. I made a promise long ago to protect a child, even if it meant being misunderstood. Some truths bring relief, others only bring pain. Nora felt a strange pull in her chest, a mix of gratitude and frustration. Why protect her from her own story? Why carry this alone? She turned the page. Because love sometimes chooses silence. Nora closed the notebook slowly. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls of the house. The sound reminded her of nights long ago when she had slept here, listening to storms while her grandmother sat beside her bed. Nora stood and walked to her grandmother's bedroom. The room was simple. The bed neatly made. Clothes folded in drawers. A small mirror hung near the window. Nora opened the wardrobe and found a single coat still hanging there. She pressed her face into the fabric and breathed in deeply. It still smelled faintly of her grandmother. Nora sat on the edge of the bed and let the memories come. The laughter. The arguments. The quiet afternoons. The stories told and the stories avoided. Her eyes fell on a small wooden box on the bedside table. She had not noticed it earlier. She opened it. Inside was a key. Attached to it was a small tag. For the place you never asked about. Nora's heart began to race. She stood quickly and looked around the room. Her eyes moved to the far corner, where a tall cabinet stood against the wall. She remembered that cabinet. As a child, it had always been locked. Nora crossed the room and slid the key into the lock. The door opened. Inside the cabinet was a narrow door set into the wall, almost hidden by shadow. It blended so well that it could be missed entirely unless you knew to look. Nora's breath grew shallow. She placed her hand on the door. I am ready now, she said softly. She opened it. Behind the door was a small room, no bigger than a closet. Inside were shelves filled with photo albums and a single chair. On the wall hung one large framed picture. Nora stepped closer. It was a photo of her as a child, sleeping on the couch, her grandmother sitting beside her, watching over her with tired but loving eyes. Beneath the photo was a note written carefully. This was the moment I knew I would stay. Nora's legs weakened. She sat down slowly, tears rising again, but this time they felt different. Not sharp. Not painful. They were full. Her grandmother had chosen this life. Chosen the quiet. Chosen the loneliness so Nora could grow up free of burdens she was not ready to carry. Nora covered her face with her hands and cried again, but now her tears carried gratitude along with grief. She stayed in that room until the light outside began to fade. As evening settled over the house, Nora stood and closed the small door gently. She returned the key to its box. She was not finished yet. There was still one truth left. The truth her grandmother believed Nora was finally strong enough to face. Night settled slowly around the house, wrapping it in quiet shadows. Nora lit the small lamp in the living room and sat on the couch where she used to curl up as a child. The light was warm but soft, leaving the corners of the room dim. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and calm. Nora held the notebook again. She knew now that it was more than memories. It was a guide. Her grandmother had shaped it carefully, step by step, leading her here. She flipped to the last section. The handwriting was slower, the lines less even. If you have reached this part, then you have already forgiven me a little. That is all I ever hoped for. Nora closed her eyes for a moment, then kept reading. There is one truth I could never hide forever. It is not about loss, it is about choice. Nora felt her pulse quicken. Your mother did not leave because she did not love you, she left because she was afraid she would become me. Nora's breath caught. She had never imagined that. The words continued. She feared staying would trap her in a life of quiet sacrifice. I told her she was allowed to want more, but I stayed so she could go. Nora's hands trembled. Her grandmother had not been abandoned. She had made space. The final pages told the full story. When Nora was very young, her parents struggled. Work pulled them away, stress filled their home, and decisions were made in haste. Nora's grandmother stepped in, not to replace anyone, but to protect what mattered most. Nora had been that thing. Her grandmother took her in, raised her, built a life around her presence. When Nora's parents finally settled elsewhere, they believed the distance would be temporary. But time grew heavy. Guilt grew louder. Visits became rare. Calls shorter. And her grandmother stayed. Not because she had to. Because she chose to. Nora closed the notebook and pressed it to her chest. The pain she had carried for years shifted, rearranged itself into something clearer. Her childhood had not been shaped by abandonment. It had been shaped by love strong enough to stand alone. She stood and walked to the kitchen. On the wall hung an old calendar, still turned to the month her grandmother passed away. Nora reached up and turned the page. Tomorrow. She smiled sadly at the simple word. That night, Nora slept in her grandmother's bed. The mattress was firm, the blankets heavy. For the first time since the funeral, she slept deeply, without dreams that woke her in fear. Morning arrived gently. Sunlight filtered through the windows, painting the floor with soft gold. Birds called from the trees. The house breathed again. Nora woke with a strange calm in her chest. She made breakfast using the same pan her grandmother always used. She ate at the small table, watching the light move across the room. Then she opened the front door and stepped outside. The land stretched quietly around her. The hills. The trees. The silence that once felt lonely now felt protective. Nora walked to the edge of the clearing and sat on a stone her grandmother used to rest on during walks. She looked back at the house. It was not a place of sadness. It was a place of courage. Nora returned inside and gathered the letters, the notebook, and the small box of keepsakes. She placed them neatly back in the hidden room. Some things did not need to leave the house. Some stories belonged exactly where they were born. Before closing the door, she added something new. A photo of herself as she was now. And a short note. I understand now, thank you. She closed the door gently. Later that afternoon, Nora stood at the window and made a decision that felt steady, not rushed. She would not sell the house. She would not run from it either. She would keep it as a place of return. A place where memory and truth could rest without fear. A place where love did not need to explain itself. As she locked the front door and walked to her car, Nora felt tears rise again. But this time, she smiled through them. What her grandmother left behind was not a secret meant to hurt. It was a legacy of quiet strength. And it had finally found its way home.